Tonight we go looking for the dragons. Not the small dragons of story and song, but the great ones. The world enders, the last and worst of them, and the long dark line he came from, stretching all the way back to the beginning of the world. Settle in, and make yourself comfortable, and let your eyes close. If these quiet histories help you rest, you are welcome to subscribe, and there will always be another one waiting for you in the dark. And now, let us begin. Deep under a mountain, in the dark, there is a sound. It is very low and very slow. It is the sound of something breathing, something vast. Each breath is long and deep and warm. It stirs the air in the great stone hall, and it makes a faint red glow flicker somewhere far back in the dark. In and out, slow as tides, the breathing of a thing that has been asleep for a very long time and is in no hurry at all to wake. If you crept closer, past the broken gates and down the long silent halls and out onto the floor of the great chamber, you would see what is breathing, and you would probably never leave. It is a dragon. He lies curled upon a vast heap of gold, a mountain of it, piled higher than houses, spilling across the whole floor of the hall, coins and cups and crowns and jewels beyond any counting, and he lies upon it the way a cat lies upon a warm hearth, sunk down into it, half buried. His long body is coiled around and around the hoard. His wings are folded, and his great head rests on his forelegs. And even asleep, even still, he is the most dangerous thing in the whole of the world. His name is Smaug. He is enormous, longer than a village street. His scales are dark red, and where they have pressed for years into the gold, they have become crusted and studded with gems. His underside is a waistcoat of diamonds. His claws could tear through stone. His teeth are swords, and when he wakes and opens his eyes, they are like two red lamps in the dark. And when he breathes out in anger, he breathes fire, enough fire to burn a town to ash in a single pass overhead. He is the terror of the north. He took this mountain and its treasure and its kingdom long ago in an afternoon of fire, and he has held it ever since. No one has dared to take it back. He is the last great dragon left in the world, and he is the worst. Listen to him breathe. A moment longer before we go back, in and out, slow and deep and warm. He has lain here like this for nearly 200 years. Kingdoms have risen and fallen in the world above while he slept. Wars have been fought, kings have been crowned and buried, and down here, in the dark, nothing has changed at all. The gold has not moved, the dragon has not stirred. Time, up in the living world, runs on, but time in a dragon's hall stands almost still, warm and golden and silent, wrapped around the slow breathing of the worm. That is its own kind of horror, when you think on it. A thing so old and so patient that whole centuries pass over it like a single quiet night. That is where our story is going, in the end, to Smaug, on his gold, under his mountain. But he did not come from nowhere. He was the last of a very long line, the final, dreadful flowering of something that had been growing in the dark since the world was young. To understand the worm on the gold, we have to go all the way back to the very first dragon that ever was, and to the dark hand that made it. For dragons, like so many terrible things in these old tales, were made. They did not simply grow in the wild places of the world. They were built, on purpose, as weapons, by the first and greatest of all the Dark Lords. You may remember him from other stories. Long before the enemy of the later ages, there was his master, the first darkness, the mightiest of all the great powers that sang the world into being at the beginning, who fell and became the source of all the world's evil. In the end he was called Morgoth, the black foe of the world, and he was always making things, cruel things, twisted things, weapons of every kind, to throw against the free peoples and the light. He made the orcs, breeding them in his pits. He made the trolls. He raised up demons of shadow and flame. But for a long time, in all his wars, There was one thing he lacked. He had no single weapon terrible enough and mighty enough to break the great fortresses of his enemies in one stroke. His armies could besiege a stronghold for years and fail. He wanted something that could simply fly over the walls and burn everything behind them and be its own army. He wanted a living engine of fire. So, in the deep pits of his northern fortress, in secret, over long years, he made the first dragon. We do not know exactly how. That is one of the mysteries, and the histories fall silent on it, the way they fall silent on the making of the orcs. Whatever a dragon truly is, at the root it was some living thing. It was caught and twisted and bred and fed on malice and fire over a very long time in the dark under the mountains. And what came out at last was something new and something horrible, a creature of fire and armor and endless greed, with a cold and cunning mind and a lifespan that could span whole ages of the world. The Wanidum were no them, and that like all his works, they were a corruption of something, not a true creation of his own. And the first of them had a name. The first dragon that ever walked the world was called Glaurung, and he was called, ever after, the father of dragons. Glaurung was not like Smaug. That is the first thing to know about him. He had no wings. The winged dragons, the ones that could fly, came later. Glaurung was a great crawling worm, immense and heavy, who moved upon the ground, dragging his vast body over the earth. But do not think that made him less terrible. He was the first, and in some ways the most cunning of all his kind. He was fire made into a creature. Where he passed, the grass burned, and the earth was scorched black, and a foul reek went before him. He came out of the north too soon, the first time. Morgoth loosed him before he was fully grown, in his eagerness to use his new weapon, and though Glaurung caused terror, he was driven back, still young, by the arrows of a brave elf lord. Morgoth was angry and took him back into the pits to grow. That is a small but important thing about dragons. They grow, and they last. Time only makes them larger, and stronger, and more terrible. A dragon that is dangerous when young becomes a catastrophe when it is old, and Glaurung was allowed to grow old. For a long age he was kept, and bred, and fed in the dark, until at last Morgoth loosed him again, full grown, and this time he was unstoppable. He led the Dark Lord's armies to their greatest victory. He broke the greatest siege of that age. He crawled over battlefields like a moving mountain of fire. Whole hosts of elves and men broke and fled before him. There was no weapon that could pierce his armored hide, and his very presence filled the bravest hearts with a numbing dread. Try to imagine that dread, since it is so central to what a dragon is. You are a warrior. You are brave. You have faced dark things before and stood your ground, and you know your own courage. And then a dragon comes, and something happens that has nothing to do with its size, or its fire, or its teeth. A cold weight settles on your heart. Your thoughts go slow and small. The strength runs out of your arms. Some deep and ancient part of you, older than your courage, knows the thing before you is a predator beyond all answering, and it wants only to freeze, or to kneel, or to run. That is the dragon terror. It is not in the body, it is in the soul. That dread was one of his deepest powers, and it belonged to all dragons after him. A great dragon does not only burn you, it unmakes your courage from within. To stand before one and feel its ancient eyes turn upon you is to feel very small and very foolish and very much like lying down and giving up. Glaurung was the first to wield that terror, and he wielded something worse as well. He could speak, and his words were poison. That is the last and strangest thing about the father of dragons, and about all the great dragons who came after him, down to Smaug at the end. They were not dumb beasts. They were brilliant, and they were cruel, and they loved, above all things, to talk. A dragon could hold a person with its eyes and speak to them in a soft and reasonable voice. And with that voice it could twist their thoughts and fill them with doubt and despair and lead them gently to ruin. Glaurung did this to the people who opposed him. He ensnared them with his voice and his terrible gaze, and he broke their lives apart with lies that were half true, which are the worst kind. His was a long and very sad tale of a brave family destroyed not by his fire, but by his words. In the end, Glaurung was killed. A single brave man, hidden in a ravine, thrust a black sword up into the soft, unarmored belly of the worm as it dragged itself overhead. For that is the one weakness of dragons. Their hides are armored like plates of iron, but their soft undersides are not, and a blade or an arrow that finds the belly can do what no army can. Remember that it matters very much. At the end of our story, under another mountain, an age later, so the first dragon died. But the father of dragons had done his work. He was the first, but he was very far from the last. Behind him, in the pits of the north, Morgoth was breeding more. Glaurung had been terrible enough, crawling upon the ground. But the Dark Lord was not finished. It was the last days of that first great age. The war against him had turned, and the powers of the West had come at last, in their wrath, to throw him down. And so Morgoth reached into his pits and loosed his final, most desperate weapon. He loosed the winged dragons. Until that day, no dragon had ever flown. Glaurung and his brood had been great crawling worms, bound to the earth. But now, at the very end, when all else had failed him, the Dark Lord brought forth a new kind, dragons with vast leathern wings that could rise into the air and fall upon their enemies from above, out of the sky, trailing fire. It was a horror the world had never seen. The last army of the free peoples and the host of the powers themselves had believed the war all but won, and then the sky above them went black with wings. The old tales say it was the most terrible sight in all the wars of that age. A fleet of winged dragons filling the sky, coming on like a storm of fire. For a moment, even the host of the powers was driven back before them. It seemed the Dark Lord might yet snatch victory out of his own ruin, on the wings of his last and greatest weapon, and at the head of that fleet came the greatest dragon that ever lived. His name was Ancalagon the Black, and he was the largest and mightiest of all the winged dragons, the chief of that terrible host, so vast that the old songs strained to describe him at all. He was a shadow across the sky. When he roared, mountains trembled. He was to Smaug what a mountain is to a hill. If Smaug at the end of our story is the last great terror of the world, then Ancalagon was the greatest terror the world ever knew. He belonged to the highest days of dragonkind, when they were new and at their full and dreadful strength. The battle in the sky against Ancalagon and his brood was one of the mightiest ever fought. It was not won by any army of elves or men. It was beyond them. It was won, in the end, by a single ship. A ship that sailed not the sea but the sky, carrying the brightest light left in the world, flown by the greatest of all mariners. Through a long night and a day, that ship and the great eagles of the sky battled the winged dragons above the Dark Lord's fortress, and at the last, Ancalagon the Black was thrown down, out of the sky, and he fell upon the towers of the Dark Lord's stronghold, and his falling broke them. Think on that for a moment, in the quiet. The greatest dragon that ever lived was so vast that when he was killed and fell, his body alone shattered 3 mountain peaks of iron. That is the scale of the dragons in their highest days. That is what Smaug, an age and an age later, was a last small echo of. With the fall of Ancalagon, the back of the dragon host was broken, and the Dark Lord's last weapon failed, and he himself was thrown down at last and cast out of the world. The first great age ended, and most of the dragons, that terrible brood of the north, were destroyed in that final ruin, but not all of them. That is the thread we follow now. As with the orcs, as with so many of the Dark Lord's works, the dragons were not all ended when their maker fell. A few survived. They fled the ruin of the north and crept away into the wild and empty places of the world, and hid and endured, and they bred slowly in the cold and the dark, waiting. The great days of the dragons were over, but the dragons themselves were not gone. They had only gone quiet and small and secret for a long, long age, and one day, far off, the greatest of the survivors would wake and fly south and take a mountain. Before we follow them into those long, quiet years, let us stop and ask a simple question. What is a dragon, really? We have seen what they do, but what are they underneath the fire? Because they are stranger and older and more terrible than a simple beast, and knowing what they are makes everything that comes after make sense. The first thing to know is that a dragon is not an animal. It is easy to picture a dragon as a very large, very dangerous beast, like a great crocodile with wings. That is wrong, and it is a dangerous mistake, and it has killed many who made it. A dragon has a mind, a brilliant, ancient, patient, cunning mind, often far older and sharper than the mind of any person who ever faces it. A dragon remembers, a dragon plans, a dragon can count its treasure to the last coin, and know at once if a single cup has been taken. To face a dragon is not to face a big animal. It is to face a genius who happens also to be a fortress and a furnace. The second thing is the fire. A great dragon carries fire within it. It can breathe that fire out in a roaring flood, hot enough to melt stone and turn a living thing to ash in an instant. It is their most famous weapon and their most obvious, but it is, in truth, not even the most dangerous thing about them. Fire, at least, you can see coming. The third thing is the armor. A dragon's hide is like a coat of overlapping plates, harder than any shield, that turns aside swords and spears and arrows as if they were straws. In their old age, dragons who lie long upon treasure grow a second armor as well. A crust of gold and gems presses into their soft undersides, patching the one place they are weak. This is why dragons are so nearly impossible to kill. An army can break upon a single dragon like a wave upon a rock and do it no harm at all. The fourth thing is the greed, and this is deeper and stranger than it sounds. Dragons do not gather treasure to spend it. They have no use for gold. They cannot buy anything or want anything that gold could buy. They gather it because they love it, with a deep, mad, bottomless love for its own sake. A dragon will lie upon a hoard for centuries, never spending a coin, simply possessing it, gloating over it, knowing every piece of it. The greed of dragons is a kind of madness, and it is catching, as we will see. The gold a dragon has touched carries something of that madness into the hearts of everyone who later desires it. The fifth thing is the voice, and it is the most dangerous of all. A great dragon can speak, and its speech is a weapon subtler and deadlier than its fire. A dragon's voice is smooth and reasonable and flattering, and it worms into your thoughts and turns them against you. It can make you doubt your friends. It can make you despair of your quest. It can make the maddest lie sound like simple good sense, spoken by a wise old friend who only wants to help. Never, the old tales warn, speak with a dragon, not because you might lose the argument, because you will lose yourself. And the last thing to know is the age. Dragons are terribly long-lived. They do not die of old age, so far as anyone knows. Time does not weaken them. It only makes them larger and richer and more cunning and more sure of themselves. A dragon that survives its youth may last for whole ages of the world, growing all the while. The most dangerous dragon is not a young one, fierce and quick. It is an old one, vast and slow and patient. It has had 1,000 years to grow fat on gold and clever with malice, lying in the dark, thinking its long cold thoughts and waiting. Hold all of that together in your mind, and you have a picture of the thing we are moving toward. Not a beast, a genius, and a furnace, and a fortress, and a miser, and a liar, and an immortal, all of it folded into one vast armored body, curled in the dark upon a stolen mountain of gold. That is a dragon. And in the long quiet age after the fall of the first Dark Lord, the last few of them were still out there in the cold north of the world. They were growing older and larger and more terrible, year by year, with nothing to do but wait before we follow the dragons out of the ruin of the First Age and into their long silence. There is one more thread from those deep days worth gathering up, because the dragons left behind them something that outlasted them, and it is at the very heart of our whole story. They left behind cursed gold. We will come, at the end of tonight, to the dragon sickness, the strange poison that clings to a dragon's hoard. But that sickness did not begin with Smaug. It is far older than he is. It goes all the way back to the First Age, and to the first great cursed treasure in the history of the world. And that treasure, fittingly, was bound up with the very first dragon. You may remember Glaurung, the father of dragons, the great crawling worm of fire. When at last he was slain by a blade thrust up into his belly, he left behind him a hoard, for even the first dragon had gathered treasure in the manner of his kind. He had taken the wealth of a conquered dwarf realm and an elven kingdom, and heaped it in the halls he had seized and lain upon it. And when he died, that vast treasure lay there, unguarded, gleaming in the dark, and it was cursed, doubly cursed. It carried the greed of the dragon that had lain upon it, and it carried something more in one particular piece, an even older and darker curse laid by a grieving father upon the gold that had been paid as a blood price for his murdered son. Two curses wound together in one great hoard of dragon gold. The tale of what that treasure did to the people who took it is one of the darkest in all the old stories. We will not follow all of it tonight, for it is a tale of murder and ruin from beginning to end. But the shape of it is this: everyone who took that gold was destroyed by it. It turned brother against brother. It turned love to murder. It drove strong and noble people to greed and betrayal and death, one after another down the years, passing from hand to blood-stained hand, ruining each new owner in turn. The gold itself was beautiful, and it was poison, and it could not be cleansed. That was the first great lesson of dragon gold, taught in the deeps of the First Age. The dragon is terrible while it lives, but the dragon's treasure is terrible long after the dragon is dead. The greed soaks into the gold and stays there, waiting, and rises up in the heart of whoever next comes to love it. A dragon can murder you with fire in an afternoon. A dragon's gold can murder you slowly, from the inside, over years, long after the dragon itself is bones. Hold that, all the way to the end of tonight, because Smaug, at last, will be slain, an age later, and his great hoard will lie open and free under the lonely mountain, and we will see this same ancient curse rise up again, exactly as it did in the First Age. The same poison, the same turning of friend against friend over a pile of shining metal. The dragons changed and dwindled and passed across the long ages, but the curse in their gold never changed at all. It was the same in the last dragon's hoard as it had been in the first. It is, perhaps, the truest and most lasting thing the dragons ever made. Not their fire which goes out, not their armor which rots, but the greed they left behind in the gold, which lives on and on in the hearts of men forever. So began the long silence of the dragons. For an age and more, the dragons all but vanished from the tales of the world. The great days were over. There were no more world-ending worms crawling out of the north to break the sieges of kings. The survivors of the old brood and their slow-breeding children kept to the far and empty places. They kept to the cold wastes at the top of the world, the barren mountains where no one lived. They hid, they hoarded what small treasures they could find, and they grew, slowly, in the dark, over centuries, the way dragons do. They were less than their fathers had been. That is worth saying plainly. The dragons of these later ages were a fallen and diminished kind compared to the monsters of the First Age. Ancalagon had been a shadow across the whole sky. These later dragons were smaller and fewer and lesser. But you must understand what lesser means when we are speaking of dragons. A lesser dragon was still the most dangerous single creature in the whole of the north. A lesser dragon could still destroy a kingdom. When the greatest terror the world has ever known has faded, what is left over is still terrible. The small and diminished remnant is still enough to make whole peoples flee their homes. There were different kinds of them in those cold northern mountains. Some were fire drakes, like their fathers, carrying flame within them, able to burn and to melt. And some were cold drakes, a grimmer kind that had no fire, but they were no less deadly for it, killing with fang and claw, and crushing weight and a poison of dread. All of them were armored, all of them were greedy, all of them were patient, and all of them, in that long quiet age, had a single growing hunger. Beyond even their hunger for gold, they hungered for the halls of the dwarves. For while the dragons had been dwindling in the cold north, another people had been rising there, the dwarves. And the dwarves had done the one thing most certain to draw a dragon's eye. They had dug deep and grown rich and gathered gold. You may remember the dwarves from other tales. They were a tough, stubborn, enduring people, made long ago by one of the great powers, the smith, who loved craft above all things. And the dwarves loved craft too, and stone and metal, and above all they loved gold and precious things, and the making of beautiful treasures. They delved great halls under the mountains, and there they gathered wealth, hall upon hall of it, glittering in the lamplight, deep under the stone. And that, to a dragon, is the most beautiful and maddening thing in all the world. A whole people gathering gold in one place under a mountain and piling it up and shaping it into wonders. To a dragon, a dwarf hall full of treasure is not a kingdom. It is a hoard sitting unattended, guarded by creatures far weaker than itself, simply waiting to be taken. The greed of the dragons and the wealth of the dwarves were like fire and dry grass. It was only a matter of time before they met, and meet they did, in a long and bitter war, high in the cold mountains of the north, that lasted for generations, and that the histories remember with grief. The dwarves of the north had built great and ancient kingdoms in those mountains, and one by one the dragons came for them. A dragon would come out of the waste, drawn by the smell of gold, and fall upon a dwarf hall, and for all their courage, and all their skill at arms, and all their strong stone gates, the dwarves could not stand against a full-grown dragon. Their weapons could not pierce its hide. Their walls could not keep out a thing that flew, or that could melt stone. The dragon would burn or batter its way in, and slaughter the defenders. It would drive the survivors out into the cold, and take the halls and the gold for its own. It happened again and again, over the long years. Dwarf kings fell. Whole royal lines were ended. The dwarves were driven, kingdom by kingdom, out of the northern mountains they had delved and loved for centuries. Some of their greatest lords were killed by dragons at the very doors of their own halls. It was one of the great slow tragedies of the dwarven people, this long losing war against the worms of the north. They were not destroyed by any army or any dark lord. They were eaten out of their homes, one hall at a time, by dragons. And here is the cruel part, the part that ties back to what we said about the nature of these creatures. The dragons did not even want the dwarf kingdoms. They did not want to rule, or to build, or to use the wonderful things the dwarfs had made. They wanted only to possess the gold, to lie upon it, to gloat over it. A dragon would destroy a kingdom that had taken centuries to build, and murder a whole people, and then it would simply curl up on the pile of their stolen treasure, and go to sleep on it for 100 years, doing nothing at all. All that ruin, all that grief, so that a single greedy worm could have a warm bed of gold to lie on in the dark. The dwarves never forgot it, and never forgave it. The hatred between dwarves and dragons ran very deep on the dwarven side, but hatred is not much use against an armored worm that breathes fire, and so the dwarves did the only thing they could. They retreated. They abandoned the cold north to the dragons, and went looking for new homes in mountains further south, where the dragons had not yet come. They carried their grief and their gold with them, and they started again, and they built new kingdoms, and they hoped that this time, in these new mountains, the dragons would not follow. For a while, that hope held. The dwarves found a new mountain, far to the south of the dragon-haunted wastes, a lonely peak standing by itself, above a green valley, and there they delved the greatest and richest kingdom they had built in an age. They grew wealthy beyond all their former wealth. Their halls under that lonely mountain were filled with more gold and more wonders than any dwarf hall had held for a very long time. It seemed, for a few generations, that they had finally outrun the curse of the north. They had not. They had only gathered, in one bright and glittering place, the single greatest temptation ever laid before a dragon. A mountain of gold, under a mountain of stone, far from any help and far away, in the cold north. The greatest of all the surviving dragons lifted his head. He caught the scent of it on the wind and opened his red eyes in the dark. Smaug was not the only dragon of those long quiet years, though he was the greatest. Before we follow him south to the lonely mountain, it is worth naming a few of the others, the lesser worms of the north. Their tales tell us much about what the dragons did in that dwindling age, and one of them, in particular, would leave a mark that lasted. The cold drakes were the terror of the northern mountains in those years. Remember, these were the dragons without fire, that killed with fang and claw and crushing strength and a chill of dread. They were grim and patient and cruel, and it was the cold drakes, more than any other, that made war on the dwarves of the northern ranges and drove them, hall by hall, out of their ancient homes. One of those wars struck the very line of the dwarf kings we will follow to the lonely mountain. Long before Smaug, in the cold northern mountains, a great cold drake came against the dwarves who dwelt there, and in the fighting at the doors of their halls, it slew their king and his second son with him. The king's elder son survived and led his people away, south and east, out of the dragon-haunted north, in search of safer mountains. And it was that flight, that retreat from the cold drakes, that first brought the line of those dwarf kings toward the lonely mountain in the south. There, generations later, they would build their great kingdom, and there Smaug would one day find them. So the dragons drove the dwarves to the very mountain where the greatest dragon of all would come for them in the end. The worms of the north shaped that whole history, hall by fallen hall, and there was one worm of those days whose name the old tales do keep, a great dragon called Scatha. Scatha was one of the long worms of the northern mountains, and like all his kind, he had grown fat on stolen dwarf treasure. He was slain, at last, not by a dwarf, but by a lord of the horse people. A hero of the men of the north hunted him down and killed him and took his hoard. And even there, the curse of dragon gold did its work, for the treasure of Scatha became a source of bitter quarrel. The men who had taken it and the dwarves who felt it was theirs by right fell out over it, and that quarrel poisoned the friendship between those two peoples for long years afterward. The same old story again. The dragon dies, the gold poisons whoever takes it. It happened with the first hoard in the first age, and it happened with Scatha's hoard. And it would happen, greatest of all, with Smaug's. There were others too, lesser and unnamed, dwindling drakes in the cold and hidden places. But the pattern of all their tales was the same, and it is worth fixing in the mind before we turn to Smaug. In that long age, the dragons were a diminished kind, hiding in the wastes, but wherever there was dwarf gold gathered under a mountain, sooner or later, a dragon came for it. They drove the dwarves out of the north entirely, kingdom by kingdom. They killed kings, they hoarded the plunder, and the plunder, in turn, poisoned the peoples who later fought over it. The dragons were fewer and smaller than their fathers had been, but they were still, quietly, one of the great shaping terrors of the north, all through those long years. It stayed that way, right up until the day the greatest of them all spread his wings and flew south. The lonely mountain the dwarves had chosen stood by itself, tall and grey, above a wide green valley in the north. They had come there long before and delved into its roots and found the mountain rich with veins of gold and silver and precious stone, and under the leadership of their kings, they had made it the wonder of the north. The kingdom under that mountain became the richest and most splendid of all the dwarf realms of that later age. Its halls went deep and glittered with lamplight on gold, The dwarfs there grew wealthy beyond reckoning and skilled beyond compare, and their treasures were famous across the whole of the north. They made weapons and armor and toys and wonders that even the elves came to buy, and there was one jewel among their treasures above all the rest, a great white gem of the mountain's heart, the most beautiful thing they ever found, that the king loved above all his wealth. And beneath the mountain, in the green valley, a town of men grew up beside a running river to trade with the wealthy dwarves. It was a merry, prosperous place, full of the sound of markets and bells. The men of that town and the dwarves of the mountain lived side by side in friendship and plenty. It was, for a while, one of the happiest and richest corners of the whole world. They had gathered too much gold in one place and grown too famous for it, and in the far cold north, the dragon had heard. He was the greatest of all the dragons left in the world, the last of the truly great worms, a fire drake of enormous size and age and cunning, grown vast on centuries of hoarding in the north. His name was Smaug, and one day he came for it, drawn by the rumor and the scent of the richest treasure in the north. He rose from his cold northern lair. He spread his great wings and flew south toward the lonely mountain. The old accounts remember the day he came. There was a noise like a wind coming, and a darkness in the sky from the north, and then the mountain top seemed to burst into flame. Smaug fell upon the kingdom under the mountain out of the air, in fire and ruin, with no warning that could have saved them. It was over almost before it began. That is the terrible thing about a dragon's attack. There was no siege, no long war, no chance to gather and make a stand. There was simply a full-grown fire drake falling out of the sky onto a peaceful kingdom and burning everything he touched. The dwarves who ran out to fight him died. The dwarves who ran to bar the gates died. Smaug burned the slopes of the mountain and melted the gates and poured into the halls, killing as he went. And the great kingdom under the mountain, the wonder of the north, the richest realm of the dwarves, fell in a single afternoon of fire, and he did not stop at the mountain. The merry town of men in the valley below saw the dragon come, and there was no defense against him. Smaug swept down upon the town as well, and burned it, and broke it, and scattered its people. In a single day, both the kingdom and the town, the dwarves and their neighbors, all that friendship and wealth and happiness were turned to ash and ruin and grief. The valley that had been the richest and merriest in the north became a blackened waste, a desolation, silent but for the wind. A few escaped. That is always the way in these tales, and it matters, because the few who escape carry the story forward, and sometimes, long after, the vengeance. The dwarf king and his son and a small remnant of his people escaped the sack through a secret side door and fled into exile, homeless, their kingdom and their treasure lost. And some of the townsfolk survived and remembered and rebuilt a poorer town nearby. They passed down the tale of the day the dragon came, and a hope growing fainter with each generation that one day he might be dealt with. But Smaug did not care about the few who fled. He had what he wanted. He crawled down into the deepest hall of the conquered mountain, into the great treasure chamber where the dwarves had piled the wealth of generations. He looked upon the greatest hoard in all the north, and he was, in his cold dragon way, content. He gathered it all into one great heap, and he lay down upon it, and he closed his eyes, and there he stayed. This is the part of the story that is easy to pass over, but worth sitting with in the quiet, because Smaug did not conquer the mountain to do anything with it. He took the richest kingdom in the north, and then he simply lay on the gold and did nothing for a very long time, year after year, decade after decade, nearly 200 years in the end. A vast armored worm curled in the dark on a mountain of stolen treasure, deep under the stone, barely moving, barely stirring, doing nothing at all but possessing his gold and sleeping, and now and then counting his coins and sleeping again. Above him, the mountain stood empty and silent. The halls the dwarves had carved with such love and skill were dark and dead, echoing and cold, home now to nothing but a sleeping worm. The valley outside lay desolate. Nothing grew there, nothing lived there. Travelers gave the whole region a wide and fearful berth. It became known as a cursed and blighted land, a desolation, and at its heart, under the lonely mountain, lay the dragon, on his bed of gold, in the dark. Now and then, over those long years, Smaug would stir. Once in a great while he would come out, at night, on his great wings, and fly, and hunt, and remind the north that he was still there. He was especially fond of carrying off the maidens of the valley, the old tales say, though he ate them. For a dragon does not truly want anything a person could give, but their treasure and their terror. And then he would fly back to his mountain, and crawl back down into the dark, and lie down on his gold again. And the north would hold its breath until he was still. Everyone knew he was there. That was part of his power. For nearly 200 years, the dragon under the mountain was simply a fact of the world in the north, a terror that could not be removed. Kings did not challenge him, armies did not march on him. What would be the point? He was a full-grown fire drake, armored in iron and gold, on a mountain of treasure, in a hall only he knew. To go against Smaug was simply to die, and so no one went against him. The gold sat under the mountain, uncounted and unspent and useless, and the dragon sat on the gold. The years went by, and it seemed it might go on that way forever, but nothing goes on forever. Not even a dragon on his gold. And far away, the homeless air of the mountain kingdom was growing old, and bitter, and full of a slow, deep longing to go home. And a wandering wizard, who worried about many things, had begun to worry about the dragon. He feared what might happen if anyone ever thought to wake the last great dragon in the world, and turn him to darker purposes than sleeping. But those are threads for later. For now, let the dragon sleep, in the dark, on his gold, under the mountain. And before we wake him, let us look at the strange and terrible thing his gold was doing to the world. Even while he slept, there is one more thread to draw in, before we come to the waking of the worm. And it is a large one. It is the question of why a wandering wizard cared so much about a single sleeping dragon in the north, because the wizard did care. He cared a great deal, and his reasons reached far beyond the lonely mountain, into the whole shape of the age to come. The wizard was one of the wise, a guardian of the free peoples, who spent his long life watching the slow return of an old darkness in the world. And as he watched, he began to see a danger that no one else was looking at. The old enemy, the Dark Lord of the Age, was gathering his strength again in the south and the east. And a Dark Lord gathering for war looks about him for weapons, for allies, for any great power in the world that might be turned to his side. And there, in the north, sat one of the greatest powers left in the world, unused, a full-grown fire drake on a mountain of gold in a strong fortress guarding the very gateway between the west and the wild lands of the east. Smaug, the wizard, saw it clearly, and it frightened him. Imagine, he thought, if the Dark Lord ever reached out to the dragon. Imagine the last great worm of the world, with all his fire and cunning and armored might, flying to war in the service of the enemy. A dragon and a Dark Lord together. It had happened before, in the deep past, and it had very nearly ended the world. If Smaug were ever woken to the enemy's purpose, he could sweep the north clear of every free people in it. He could open the whole northern road for the Dark Lord's armies, and there would be no power left in those lands able to stand against the two of them together. That was the wizard's secret fear. Not simply that a dragon slept under a mountain, but that a dragon slept under a mountain unwatched and unaccounted for, right at the moment when a Dark Lord was rising who might one day think to use him. The dragon was a loaded weapon, lying in the open, in a dangerous house, and no one but the wizard seemed to notice it was there. So chance, or something more than chance, brought the wizard together with the exiled heir of the mountain kingdom. And he heard the dwarf lord's burning wish to go home and reclaim his father's halls. And in that moment, the wizard saw two problems fold together into one. Here was a dwarf who wanted the dragon dead so he could have his kingdom back. And here was a wizard who wanted the dragon dead, so the enemy could never have him at all. Their reasons were different, but their goal was exactly the same. Kill the dragon. Take the loaded weapon off the board before the dark hand of the enemy could ever pick it up. That is the deeper reason the whole adventure happened at all. It looks, from the outside, like a treasure hunt, a dispossessed king going to reclaim his gold. But underneath it, guiding it, was a wizard's quiet strategy in a much larger war. The reclaiming of the mountain would put a strong and friendly people back in the north, holding the gate against the enemy. And the death of the dragon would remove forever the terrible chance that the last great worm of the world might fly to war on the wrong side. None of the company knew all of this as they set out. Most of them thought only of the gold and the vengeance and the home they had lost. But the oldest and wisest among them was playing a longer game. He was looking past the mountain, past the dragon, to the great war he could feel gathering on the edges of the world. And in that longer game, the dragon under the mountain was not the goal. He was an obstacle, a danger to be cleared away, quietly, before the real storm broke. It is a strange thought to hold at the edge of sleep. The Fall of Smaug seemed to the north like the end of an old local terror. But it was really the first small move in the last great war of the age, that the death of the last dragon helped, in its quiet way, to make possible the defeat of the last Dark Lord, years later, far to the south. The threads of the world are joined in ways no one standing inside them can see. A little company creeps east to steal back some gold, and in doing so, without most of them ever knowing it, they pull one of the enemy's last great weapons out of his reach, forever. But all of that lay hidden in the years to come. For now, there was only the long road east and the mountain at the end of it. And on that mountain slept a dragon who did not yet know that anyone in all the world still dared to come for him. There is a curse that clings to a dragon's gold. It is one of the strangest and truest things in all these tales, and it is worth understanding here in the quiet before we go on to the end. We have said that dragons are greedy, with a mad, bottomless love of gold for its own sake. But the greed of dragons does not stay with the dragons. It seeps into the treasure itself. Gold that a dragon has long lain upon, and gloated over, and loved with that sick and endless love, becomes soaked in it. It is the way a cloth becomes soaked in oil, and afterward, anyone who comes to possess that gold, or even to desire it, feels the greed creep into their own heart as well. They called it, in the old days, the dragon sickness. It is a slow poison. A person touched by it begins to love gold too much. They begin to count it, and hoard it, and guard it, and suspect their friends of wanting it. They grow greedy, and mistrustful, and cold. The dragon sickness had ruined people long before Smaug, going all the way back to the first cursed hordes of the First Age. It ran in certain treasures like a disease, passed from owner to owner down the years, and wherever it went, it turned love to suspicion, and friendship to greed, and generous hearts to grasping ones. And the gold under the lonely mountain, the vast hoard that Smaug lay upon for 2 centuries, was the most dragon-haunted treasure in all the world of that age. This matters for what is coming, so hold it close. Because when at last the dragon's hoard was won back, the winning of it did not simply bring joy, it brought the sickness too. The gold that had been taken by fire and grief would be recovered at great cost, and then it would begin, quietly, to do to its new owners exactly what it had done to the dragon. It would make them greedy, it would make them cold, it would set friend against friend, and ally against ally, over the shining, cursed, beautiful pile of it. The dragon can be killed, but the dragon's poison lingers in the gold long after the dragon is gone. That is the deepest curse of the worm. Even in death, even in defeat, the greed it soaked into its hoard goes on ruining hearts. Remember that. When we come to the end, and the dragon is dead, and the gold is free, and it does not bring the happiness that everyone expected, the dragon's sickness will still be there, waiting in the treasure, ready to turn a victory into a quarrel, and a quarrel very nearly into a war. But that is the very end. Let us go back, now, and wake the dragon. The Waking of Smaug began, Of all places, at a quiet meeting far to the west, in an inn, on a rainy evening, the homeless heir of the mountain kingdom, the grandson of the king who had fled the sack, had grown into a proud and grim and determined lord. All his long life he had carried the grief of his lost kingdom. He carried a slow and burning wish to go back and reclaim the mountain and the treasure and take vengeance on the worm that had taken it all. But he had no army that could face a dragon. No one did, and so his longing had nowhere to go for years until, by what seemed like chance, he fell into conversation with a wandering wizard. And the wizard, who had his own long thoughts and his own worries about the dragon, helped him make a plan. It was not a plan to fight Smaug with an army. That was hopeless. It was a quieter plan. A small company would go secretly to the mountain and find a hidden side door that the dragon did not watch. They would slip in and deal with the dragon by stealth and wits rather than by force. And to help them do the stealing, the wizard found them an unlikely burglar, a small, quiet, unassuming creature from a peaceful land far away. The last person in the world a dragon would ever expect. A hobbit. We will not follow every step of their long road to the mountain tonight. It is a whole tale of its own. But in the end, the company came to the lonely mountain, that blighted and desolate peak above the ruined valley. They found the hidden door, and on the right day, with the last light of a setting sun, it opened, and the little burglar, alone, in the dark, went down the long secret passage. He went toward the sleeping dragon, to do the thing he had been brought all that way to do. And so, for the first time in 200 years, a living creature crept into the presence of Smaug. The hobbit came out of the passage into the great treasure hall, and saw, by a dim red glow, the thing he had come for. Smaug, vast and red gold, curled upon a hoard so huge it could not be counted, a mountain of gold and gems with a sleeping dragon coiled upon its peak. The little burglar, terrified, crept forward and took a single great two-handled cup from the edge of the hoard and fled back up the passage with it, his heart hammering. It was a mistake. A small one, but a fatal one. Because a dragon knows its hoard, every coin, every cup. And when Smaug woke and stretched and looked upon his gold, as he had 1,000 times before, he knew at once, instantly, that a single cup was missing. And the rage of a dragon robbed is a terrible thing to see. Smaug came awake in fury. He roared, and the mountain shook. He rushed from his hall and burst out of the mountain into the night, breathing fire, searching the slopes for the thief. He found no one, for the company had hidden, and in his rage he turned on the nearest thing he could find, and flew down and destroyed what little the earlier sack had left. He hunted and burned and searched, and at last, finding nothing, he crawled back into his hall to brood. And it was then, on the little burglar's second visit, that the most dangerous part of the whole adventure happened. Not the stealing, the talking, for the hobbit crept down again. And this time Smaug was awake and waiting, and he could smell that something was there, though he could not see it. And the dragon spoke, and here was the oldest danger of dragons, the one we heard about all the way back with the father of dragons, that smooth, terrible, reasonable voice worming into the mind of the one who listened. The hobbit, to his credit, did not give his true name, and did not answer plainly. He spoke to the dragon in riddles and flattery, which was the only safe way, if any way was safe, and Smaug, for his part, was delighted to have someone to talk to and to gloat before. After 200 silent years, he boasted. He showed off his armor of gold and gems, his terrible teeth, his strength, and in his pride, showing off the diamond waistcoat crusted onto his belly, he revealed, without meaning to, the one thing his enemies most needed to know, because the hobbit, with his sharp eyes, saw that the great crusted armor of the dragon's underside was not quite complete. There was a bare patch, a hollow in the left of his breast where the gold had not stuck, and the soft, unarmored hide showed through. One small bare place over the dragon's heart, the one weakness, the same weakness that had killed the father of dragons an age before, a soft belly that a blade or an arrow could pierce. The hobbit fled the hall, with the dragon's fire roaring up the passage behind him, but he carried the secret out with him. The dragon had a bare patch. Smaug could be killed, and now someone knew where. The end of Smaug came quickly, and it did not come the way anyone had planned. The dragon, enraged twice now by the thief in his mountain, worked himself into a black fury. He had decided who was to blame. Not the little creature he could not find, but the town of men down the river. He was sure the poor rebuilt town of the survivors had sent the thieves, and so Smaug did what dragons do. He decided to make an example. He heaved himself out of the mountain one last time, a great red-gold terror rising into the night sky, and he flew down the valley toward the town by the water, to burn it, and everyone in it, to ash. The people of the town saw him coming. A growing red glow in the north, and then the shape of him against the stars, vast and winged and terrible, coming on fast. Most fled, but some stayed to fight, though fighting seemed hopeless, for what can arrows do against the dragon? They loosed their arrows at him as he came, and the arrows glanced off his iron hide and his gold-crusted belly and fell away, doing nothing. It was exactly as arrows always had against a dragon, for an age of the world. But there was one man there who did not flee, and who had one special arrow. He was a grim archer of the town, a descendant of the old lords of the ruined valley, and he had with him a great black arrow, an heirloom passed down in his family from the days before the dragon came. And as Smaug wheeled overhead, raining fire, a small bird came to the archer's ear. It was an old and clever thrush, and it told him the secret that the little burglar had carried out of the mountain and passed along. The dragon has a bare patch, a hollow of the left breast. Aim there. The archer set his last black arrow to his bow. He drew it back to his ear, all his strength and all his hope in that single shot. He waited as the dragon turned again and roared down upon the town, his belly exposed as he came, and the archer let fly. The black arrow flew true. It found the one bare patch, the hollow over the heart, the single unarmored place in all that vast armored body, and it struck home and drove deep, straight into the dragon's heart. Smaug screamed. It was a sound that split the night and shattered the silence of 200 years. It was a shriek of shock and agony and disbelief from a creature that had believed itself beyond all harm. He convulsed in the air. His fire went out, his great wings failed, and the last great dragon of the world fell out of the sky, dead, crashing down in ruin upon the very town he had come to destroy. The waters hissed and steamed where he fell, and then there was silence and dark, and the terror that had ruled the north for 2 centuries was simply, suddenly, over, killed by a single arrow, aimed at a single bare patch, guided by a secret carried out by the smallest and least likely creature in the whole tale, and whispered by a bird, the genius, the furnace, the fortress, the immortal terror, undone in a heartbeat by one good shot in the dark. That is how dragons die, when they die at all. Not by armies, by a single blade or arrow that finds the one place they are weak, in the hands of one brave soul who does not run. And so the dragon was gone, and the mountain and the greatest hoard in the world lay open and unguarded at last. You might think that is a happy ending. The dragon dead, the treasure freed, the exiled king able to come home to his mountain at last. And it was, in part. But remember the dragon sickness, remember the curse in the gold, for no sooner was the dragon dead than the trouble over his gold began. The homeless heir came at last to his mountain, and looked upon the recovered hoard of his fathers, and the sickness took him. He grew grim and greedy and suspicious. The men of the ruined town, who had lost everything and slain the dragon, asked for a fair share, to rebuild their homes. The wood elves nearby made their own claims, and the king under the mountain refused them all. Poisoned by the gold he had waited his whole life to reclaim, he shut his gates and sat on his treasure, guarding it, hoarding it. He grew colder and more suspicious by the day. Exactly, precisely, like the worm that had lain there before him. It came within a breath of war. Men and elves and dwarves, who should have been allies, very nearly slew one another over the dragon's cursed gold. And all the while the dragon himself lay dead and rotting in the lake, his work still poisoning the world from beyond his own death. It was only saved at the very last. A far greater danger, an army of orcs and wolves out of the mountains, fell upon them all and forced the quarrelling peoples to stand together or die. And in that battle, fighting side by side at last, they remembered they were friends. The sickness was broken, and the gold in the end was shared and did some good, but it was a very near thing. And it is the last great lesson of the dragons, and the truest. The dragon can be killed, the fire can be put out, the armor pierced, the terror ended, with the greed, the deep sick greed that is the real heart of a dragon, does not die with the dragon. It lives on in the gold, it waits in the treasure, and it will rise up in the heart of anyone who loves gold too much and do the dragon's work for him. It does this long after the dragon himself is bones at the bottom of a lake. Smaug's deadliest weapon was never his fire, it was his gold, and his gold outlived him. So we come to the end of the dragons. Smaug was the last of them, the last of the truly great dragons, the last worm mighty enough to take a kingdom and hold it. When that black arrow found his heart, it was not just the death of one dragon, it was very nearly the end of an entire kind. There were, perhaps, a few lesser drakes still lingering in the cold and hidden corners of the world, dwindled and diminished, small and mean and hiding. But the great dragons were another matter, the world enders, the terrible children of the first Dark Lord. They had begun with the father of dragons in the deeps of the First Age. They had reached their height with the black shadow of Ancalagon across the sky, and they had dwindled down the long years to a single fire drake on a stolen mountain of gold. That long and dreadful line ended, forever, over a lake in the north, with a single arrow on a dark night. They had been among the oldest and most terrible things in the whole world. They had burned kingdoms and broken sieges and ended royal lines and hoarded the wealth of ages in the dark. And now they were gone. The age of the great dragons was over. The sky over the north was empty of wings, and it would stay empty from that night on, forever. The mountain still stands, in the north, above its valley. The gold is long since spent, or scattered, or passed into other hands. The bones of the last great dragon are long since sunk into the mud of the lake and forgotten, and the world had held its breath for so long whenever a shadow crossed the northern sky. Now it learnt slowly how to breathe again, in a world with no more dragons in it. That is the end of the tale of the worms of the north. There is nothing left to fear in it now. The fire is out. The terror is dead. The last dragon fell an age ago, over a cold lake, and never rose again. And there is nothing crossing the sky tonight but the slow and harmless stars. So let the dragons sink back down into the dark where they belong. Harmless now, only a story. Let the gold and the fire and the long slow ruin of it all drift away. The night is quiet, the sky is empty, and nothing is coming. Thank you for spending this long night among the dragons. If these quiet histories help you sleep, there will always be another one waiting for you in the dark. Sleep well now. The fire is out, the last worm is dead, and the north is finally, gently, at peace. Sleep well.